What would you do if you returned home to find that your land, your inheritance, your memory, your truth had been stolen, paved over, and sold as someone else's empire? What happens when illusion collides with evidence, when arrogance collides with ownership, when a single cabin collides with 88 houses? This is not just a story about property. It is a story about power, about silence, about the violence of bureaucracy disguised as order. And it is the story of how I came back and destroyed everything they thought they had built. I came back to my land not with fanfare, but with footsteps that carried memory and the silence of absence that had stretched too long. The road that once ended in wilderness now stretched into a neighborhood, a grid of asphalt and symmetry, where there had once been only trees and soil. My cabin, weathered but unbroken, stood at the edge of something unrecognizable, like a relic in a museum of illusions. I paused, not because I was lost, but because I was confronted with the audacity of erasure. 88 houses, lined in rows, painted in neutral tones, each with manicured lawns and mailboxes that pretended permanence. They called it development. I called it theft. Because beneath every foundation, beneath every driveway, beneath every porch light was my land, my soil, my inheritance. And yet no one asked, no one paused, no one wondered what had been displaced to make room for their comfort. I walked the streets slowly, each step a confrontation with the arrogance of assumption. Children played in yards that were not theirs. Dogs barked behind fences that cut across my boundaries. Neighbors waved politely, unaware that their very presence was trespass. And I thought, how many empires are built on silence? How many illusions survive because those who should speak are absent? My absence had been their opportunity. My silence had been their permission. But silence is not consent. Absence is not surrender. And when I returned not as a visitor, but as a witness. I touched the bark of the old oak tree that still marked the corner of my deed, its roots deeper than any surveyor's line, its branches older than any ordinance. It remembered me, even if they did not. And in that moment I realized the land does not forget. It waits. It endures. It holds truth beneath the weight of illusion. The empire they built was not theirs. It was borrowed. It was fragile. It was a performance waiting for interruption. And I was the interruption. I stood in the middle of their street, the asphalt warm beneath my boots, and I felt the absurdity of it all. They had paved over my truth, and yet they expected me to move, to yield, to vanish. But I had returned, and return is a form of resistance. My presence was enough to fracture their illusion. My silence had ended, and with it, their comfort, because when the rightful owner returns, the trespass is no longer invisible. It is undeniable. And I knew in that first moment of shock that this was not just about land. It was about power, about illusion, about the violence of forgetting. And I was ready to remind them, ready to unfold the truth, ready to destroy the empire they thought was untouchable. The first strike did not come with bulldozers or chainsaws. It came with paper, a letter, folded neatly, slipped into my mailbox as if it were nothing more than a routine notice. But paper can cut deeper than steel when it carries the weight of authority. The letter was from the HOA, written in the language of bureaucracy, polite, measured, and merciless. It informed me that my cabin, the one structure that had endured storms, seasons, and silence, was now considered non-compliant. Non-compliant with what? With their vision, with their illusion of order, with the aesthetic they had imposed on land that was never theirs. I read the words slowly, each sentence a blade disguised as courtesy. They spoke of harmony, of uniformity, of community standards. But beneath the rhetoric was a demand. Move. Relocate. Erase yourself. They wanted me gone not because I was wrong, but because I was inconvenient. My cabin disrupted their symmetry. My presence disrupted their illusion. And so they wielded paper like a weapon, hoping I would fold as easily as the letter itself. I held it in my hands, feeling its weightless cruelty, and I thought, how many lives are displaced by documents? How many histories are erased by signatures? How many truths are buried beneath the quiet violence of bureaucracy? The letter did not shout. It whispered, and whispers are more dangerous than screams, because they slip beneath the skin unnoticed. I pinned it to my wall, not as a warning, but as evidence. Evidence that illusion always reveals itself in writing. Evidence that power prefers paper to confrontation. Evidence that systems hide behind ink when they fear the solidity of truth. I walked outside, looked at the rows of houses, and realized none of them had received such a letter. Their compliance was assumed, their belonging unquestioned. Only I was marked, only I was targeted, because only I disrupted the narrative. And I thought, this is how systems operate, not with open violence, but with quiet erasure, not with confrontation, but with paperwork, not with truth, but with illusion. The letter was not just a demand. It was a declaration that my existence was incompatible with their empire. But I knew better. I knew the land beneath their houses was mine. I knew the soil beneath their streets was mine. I knew the truth was mine. And truth, once revealed, cannot be evicted. I folded the letter carefully, placed it beside my deed, and smiled, not with joy, but with clarity, because clarity is the beginning of resistance, and resistance, once begun, does not retreat. The letter had not defeated me. It had awakened me, and I was ready to answer, not with silence, but with evidence, not with compliance, but with confrontation, not with surrender, but with truth. I didn't start with anger. I started with a map, not the kind they printed for real estate brochures, but the original, hand-drawn, notarized, stamped by the county, and passed down through generations like a quiet inheritance. It showed every line, every coordinate, every inch of soil that belonged to my family. And it showed something else. The street they built, the houses they sold, the empire they claimed, cut directly through my land. I laid the map on my cabin table, the wood beneath it groaning like it too remembered the trespass. I traced the lines with my finger, slowly, deliberately, as if touching truth could make it louder, because truth, when buried, doesn't disappear. It waits, and this map was waiting to be seen. I took it to the county office, where the clerk blinked at it like it was a relic. "This can't be right," she said. But it was. It had always been. What wasn't right was a new map, the one they used to justify the development, the one that erased my boundaries in favor of their grid. I requested a comparison. They hesitated, because systems don't like being confronted with contradiction. But contradiction is the beginning of clarity, and clarity is the beginning of accountability. The overlay revealed everything. The street ran through my land. The houses sat on my soil. The HOA governed what they didn't own. I asked for the surveyor's name. They gave me a company. I called. They deflected. We were told the land was clear. Told by whom? Told by illusion. Told by assumption. Told by the momentum of development that never pauses to ask permission. I requested the original zoning documents. They were incomplete, conveniently, because convenience is the enemy of truth. I brought the map to the HOA office. They frowned. They whispered. They tried to smile. "We'll look into it," they said. But I wasn't asking. I was informing, because when you hold the original map, you hold the original truth, and truth, once unfolded, cannot be refolded into silence. I pinned the map to my cabin wall, beside the letter, a collage of contradiction, a gallery of exposure. And I thought, how many empires collapse when the map is redrawn? Not with violence, with evidence, with lines that refuse to be erased. The map was my weapon, not because it was sharp, because it was undeniable. And I knew they hadn't just built on my land. They had built on borrowed time, and time, when reclaimed, becomes reckoning. They called it a compliance review. I called it a performance, a carefully staged ritual where power pretends to listen while preparing to dismiss. The HOA board sat behind a long table, their nameplates gleaming under fluorescent lights, their expressions rehearsed. I walked in with a folder, not thick, not dramatic, just precise, because precision is what power fears most. Not volume, not rage, precision. I placed the folder on the table and said nothing. Let them speak first. Let them reveal their assumptions. "We understand there's been some confusion." The chair began, voice smooth like a blade. Confusion. That's what they called it. Not trespass. Not theft. Not erasure. Confusion. I opened the folder and slid out the map. The original. The one with my grandfather's signature. The one with the county seal. The one that didn't lie. I placed it in front of them and watched their eyes shift. Not wide with shock, narrow with calculation. Because power doesn't panic. It recalibrates. This doesn't match our records, one of them said. I nodded. Your records are wrong. A pause. A flicker. A crack. I laid out the timeline next. Dates. Permits. Zoning changes. All annotated. All sourced. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Truth, when presented without apology, is louder than any accusation. They shuffled papers. Whispered. One cleared his throat. Even if the land was yours, the structures have been here for years. I looked at him. So has the truth. You just ignored it. Another leaned forward. What do you want? The question was honest. Desperate. I smiled, not with triumph, but with clarity. I want you to see what you built. Not the houses. The illusion. Silence. Heavy. Dense. The kind that follows a mirror being held up too close. I gathered my papers, stood, and said, "This isn't a request. It's a reckoning." And I walked out, not because I was finished, because I had begun. The meeting wasn't about resolution. It was about confrontation, about forcing power to look at itself and flinch. And I knew they would not forget this moment, because precision, once delivered, cannot be undone. It lingers. It festers. It demands response. And I was ready for whatever came next. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They didn't apologize. The neighbors, those who lived in the 88 houses built on my land, existed in a kind of curated ignorance. Not malicious. Not innocent. Just convenient. They waved when I passed. Smiled. Some even complimented the cabin, calling it quaint, as if it were a decorative artifact in their curated suburbia. I watched them mow lawns that weren't theirs, host barbecues on patios that sat atop my soil. And I wondered, what does it mean to live on stolen land without knowing it? Or worse, without caring? I spoke to a few, explained the map, the deed, the history. Some blinked, some nodded. One said, "That's crazy," and walked away. Because truth, when inconvenient, is often dismissed as madness. But madness is not the presence of contradiction. It's the refusal to acknowledge it. I saw their discomfort, the way they avoided eye contact, the way they changed the subject. Because silence is easier than reckoning. And silence, when chosen, becomes complicity. One neighbor, an older man with a garden, listened, really listened. He asked questions. He frowned. He said, "They never told us." I nodded. "They never asked me." He paused. "What happens now?" I didn't have an answer, because this wasn't just about legal boundaries. It was about moral ones, about the lines we draw between comfort and conscience. Some neighbors began to whisper, to speculate, to worry, not about justice, about property values, about disruption, about the illusion cracking. And I realized they weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of truth, because truth, once spoken, demands response, and response threatens comfort. I became the shadow in their perfect neighborhood, the reminder that history hadn't been erased. It had been ignored, and ignored history always returns, not with vengeance, with presence, with evidence, with the quiet insistence that silence is not neutrality. It is a choice, a side, a stance. And I knew I wasn't just confronting the HOA. I was confronting a culture, a system, a neighborhood built not just on my land, but on the assumption that no one would challenge the illusion. But I had returned, and return is a disruption, a mirror, a reckoning, and I was ready to be all three. Before the lawsuits, before the letters, before the maps, there was history, not the kind written in textbooks, but the kind etched into soil, passed down through stories, preserved in silence. My grandfather bought this land with hands calloused from labor and a heart stubborn with principle. He didn't trust systems. He trusted boundaries. He trusted memory. And he kept everything deeds, letters, agreements, in a box beneath the floorboards of the cabin. I opened that box for the first time in years, and it felt like opening a wound. Inside were documents yellow with time but sharp with truth. A letter from the county, dated decades ago, confirming the perimeter. A signed agreement with a neighboring farmer, establishing shared access. A surveyor's sketch, hand-drawn, precise, unambiguous. And I thought, how many conflicts begin not with malice, but with forgetting? Because forgetting is a kind of violence. It erases without blood. It displaces without noise. The HOA didn't know this history. They didn't care. They built over it, paved through it, landscaped across it. But history, when buried, doesn't die. It waits. And now it was awake. I brought the documents to the county office. The clerk blinked. We don't have these on file. Of course they didn't. Because systems forget what doesn't serve them. But forgetting doesn't make truth disappear. It makes it dangerous. I scanned every page, annotated every margin, built a timeline not of events, but of erasures. And I realized this wasn't just about land. It was about memory, about the fragility of truth in the face of convenience. The HOA had built their empire on the assumption that history was irrelevant. But history is a foundation of ownership, of belonging, of resistance. I shared the documents with a lawyer. He read them slowly, then looked at me. This changes everything. Yes, because truth, when documented, becomes undeniable. And undeniable truth is the beginning of collapse. For illusions, for empires, for systems built on forgetting. I returned to the cabin, placed the box back beneath the floorboards, and felt the weight of legacy, not as burden, as weapon, as shield, as mirror. Because history doesn't just explain the present. It confronts it. It demands accountability. And I was ready to demand it, not with rage, with records, with memory, with a quiet insistence that what was once agreed cannot be unagreed, that what was once owned cannot be unowned, that what was once buried must now be seen. It didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a hallway, a corridor outside the county zoning office, where two officials whispered over my documents like students caught cheating on a test they didn't study for. I had submitted everything, maps, deeds, letters, timelines, not as a protest, as a mirror. And mirrors, when held up to systems, don't flatter. They reveal. One official, younger, eager to deflect, said, "This must be a clerical error." I nodded. Then why did it survive 15 years? The other, older, quieter, said nothing, because silence in the face of exposure is often the first admission. I watched them scan the documents, trace the lines, reread the coordinates, and I saw it, the moment when illusion collapses. Not loudly, internally. The HOA had built its authority on assumption, on the belief that no one would question the foundation. But foundations, when cracked, don't hold. And mine was no longer cracked. It was exposed. I requested a formal review, a public hearing, a chance to speak, not just to the board, but to the system that had paved over my truth. They granted it, reluctantly, because exposure is contagious. It spreads. It infects. It forces systems to see themselves, not as they claim to be, but as they are. The hearing was quiet. No cameras, no press, just officials, papers, and the weight of contradiction. I spoke slowly, deliberately, without theatrics. "You built a street on my land," I said, "then asked me to move my home to preserve your illusion." They shifted. They scribbled. They sighed. But they didn't deny, because denial, once exposed, becomes absurd. I presented the timeline, the maps, the letters, the silence, and I asked, what happens when the system is wrong? Not rhetorically, literally. Because systems rarely prepare for their own failure. They prepare for resistance, for protest, for noise, but not for precision, not for truth, not for exposure. One official finally spoke. "We'll need to reevaluate the easement." And that sentence, so simple, so overdue, was the crack, the beginning of accountability, not resolution, recognition, because recognition is the first step toward repair. The HOA didn't attend. They sent a statement, a paragraph of deflection. But deflection doesn't survive exposure. It evaporates. And I knew the system had seen itself, not in my words, in its own reflection. And once seen, it couldn't unsee. The cabin remained. The street remained. But the illusion was gone. And in its place stood truth, unfolded, undeniable, unyielding. The cabin still stands. Not just physically, but symbolically, a structure that refused to move, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. The street still curves to my land, a scar that no longer hides beneath the surface. And the HOA, once confident, once unquestioned, now walks with caution. Their letters have stopped. Their meetings are quieter. Their authority, once assumed, now feels borrowed. But this story isn't about victory. It's about legacy, about what remains after the illusion is broken. I walk the perimeter of my land often now, not to defend it, but to remember it, to remember that ownership is more than paperwork. It's presence, it's history, it's the refusal to be erased. The neighbors wave more now. Some stop to talk. Some ask questions. And I answer, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Because clarity, once earned, becomes a gift, a way to teach, a way to warn, a way to say, this happened, don't let it happen again. The cabin has become a landmark, not on any map, in memory, in narrative, in resistance. I've received letters from others, people who face similar erasures, similar demands, similar silences. They ask how I stood. I tell them, with truth, with documentation, with a refusal to disappear, because disappearance is what systems expect. Quiet compliance, passive surrender. But legacy is built on refusal, on the decision to say, no, I belong here. And belonging, once claimed, becomes contagious. It spreads. It inspires. It redefines. The county has begun reviewing old easements, not because they want to, because they have to, because exposure demands reform. And reform begins with recognition. The cabin hasn't changed, but everything around it has. The narrative, the power dynamic, the silence. And I know this story will outlive the conflict. It will become a lesson, a warning, a mirror, because when illusion breaks, truth doesn't just emerge, it endures. And I will endure with it, not as a protester, as a witness, as a reminder. That land remembers, that history speaks, that silence, once broken, becomes legacy.